Marcus Hawthorne froze in his bedroom doorway, car keys slipping from his fingers and clattering onto marble floor. There, in his king-sized bed, lay Keisha Washington, the black maid he'd hired just 2 months ago, curled protectively around his 6-year-old twins, all 3 of them fast asleep. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not in his house, not with his children. His business partner's warning echoed in his mind. Never trust the help with your kids. The sound of his own breathing seemed deafening in the sudden silence. Jaden and Jordan hadn't slept through the night in 2 years, not since their mother died, yet here they were, peaceful as angels against this woman's chest. His hand trembled as rage and disbelief warred in his chest, every muscle in his body coiled tight, ready to explode. "Get away from my sons," he whispered, voice deadly quiet. But something was wrong with this picture. Something he couldn't quite grasp. Why weren't they crying? Why did they look so safe? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months earlier, Marcus Hawthorne had been a different man. His tech company, Hawthorne Industries, was preparing for the biggest IPO in Atlanta's history, $847 million that would cement his place among Georgia's elite. He'd built everything from nothing, crawling out of a trailer park in Valdosta, to create an empire that employed 3,000 people across the Southeast. But success meant nothing when you couldn't keep your children from screaming through the night. The parade of nannies had become a cruel joke among his Buckhead neighbors. 47 women in 2 years, each one lasting an average of 12 days before fleeing his mansion like refugees from a war zone. The twins, Jaden and Jordan, had been different since their mother Sarah's car accident, different in ways that Marcus couldn't understand and doctors couldn't fix. Jaden hadn't spoken a word since the funeral. He'd rock back and forth for hours, building elaborate towers with blocks only to smash them down in screaming fits. Jordan was the opposite. Brilliant, articulate, but so sensitive that the wrong texture of clothing could send him into meltdowns that lasted for days. Both boys seemed to exist in a world where their father was nothing more than a stranger who paid the bills. Marcus had tried everything money could buy: pediatric psychiatrists from Emory University, behavioral specialists from Children's Healthcare of Atlanta, sleep consultants, nutrition experts, even a shaman that his desperate mother-in-law had recommended. Nothing worked. The boys grew more withdrawn, more violent, more unreachable with each passing month. Then came Keisha Washington, responding to his ad for household assistance, with a handwritten note that was both humble and oddly confident. She was 35, lived in Auburn Avenue with her grandmother, and needed work badly enough to clean toilets for a living. During their brief interview, she'd barely looked at him, speaking in soft, measured tones about her experience with difficult situations. Marcus had hired her out of desperation more than hope. She was the cheapest option available, and frankly, he'd stopped expecting miracles from anyone. But something changed the first day she walked through his doors. The boys, who typically hid from strangers, had watched her with curious eyes. She'd spoken to them like they were intelligent human beings rather than broken toys, asking Jordan about his drawings and sitting perfectly still while Jaden arranged and rearranged her cleaning supplies. For 3 weeks, the house had been different. Not perfect. The boys still had their moments, but manageable. Keisha moved through their routines with an intuitive understanding that seemed impossible for someone without formal training. And tonight, coming home from his emergency trip to Tokyo, Marcus had discovered the impossible. His son sleeping peacefully in his own bed, protected by a woman he barely knew. "What the hell do you think you're doing in my bed?" The words exploded from Marcus's throat like shards of glass, shattering the peaceful silence. His voice carried the full weight of his shock, his fury, and something darker, a primal fear he couldn't name. Keisha's eyes snapped open instantly, the practiced alertness of someone who'd learned to wake up ready for trouble. She didn't gasp or scramble like the other nannies might have. Instead, she carefully shifted away from the twins, her movements deliberate and protective, creating a barrier between the boys and their father's rage. "Mr. Hawthorne," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the storm she could see brewing in his eyes. "I can explain." But Marcus wasn't listening. All he could see was the wrongness of it. This black woman in his dead wife's place, in the bed where Sarah used to read bedtime stories, where she used to hold their boys when nightmares struck. The bed that had been sacred, untouchable since the accident. "They had night terrors," Keisha continued, slowly sitting up while keeping her hands visible, non-threatening. "Jaden had a nosebleed, and Jordan was screaming so loud the neighbors called. I couldn't calm them down any other way." Her explanation fell on deaf ears. Marcus's mind was spinning through every horror story he'd heard about household staff. Every warning from his business associates about trusting outsiders with precious things. His hands shook with adrenaline and something uglier, assumptions he didn't want to examine too closely. "I don't care what excuse you have," he growled, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You crossed a line. You don't belong here." The twins stirred at the sound of their father's voice, but they didn't wake. Jaden's arm tightened around his stuffed elephant, and Jordan's breathing remained deep and even. For the first time in 2 years, they were sleeping through raised voices. Keisha noticed what Marcus couldn't or wouldn't see. She glanced down at the boys, then back at their father, and something shifted in her expression, a sadness that ran deeper than disappointment. "They begged me not to leave them alone," she said, her voice barely audible. "Jaden grabbed my hand and wouldn't let go. Jordan asked me to sing the lullaby their mama used to sing. I couldn't." The crack of palm against cheek echoed through the bedroom like a gunshot. Marcus's hand burned from the impact, his chest heaving as if he'd run a marathon. He stared at his palm, then at Keisha's face, where a red mark was already blooming across her dark skin. She touched her cheek once, slowly, then dropped her hand to her side. She didn't cry out, didn't curse him or threaten to sue or call the police like he might have expected. She just looked at him with those steady brown eyes, and for a moment, Marcus saw something that made his stomach twist. Not surprise, but recognition. As if she'd been hit before, as if she'd been expecting it. "Get out," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Get out of my house right now." Keisha stood carefully, smoothing down her simple cotton dress. She leaned over and kissed the top of Jaden's head, then Jordan's, her movements tender despite the mark on her face. "I left you a note," she said quietly, nodding toward the nightstand where a folded piece of paper sat beside Sarah's photograph. "About their routines, what works, what doesn't, just in case." She picked up her worn canvas bag from the floor, the same bag she'd carried every day for 3 months. As she moved toward the door, she paused and looked back at the sleeping boys one last time. "They're good boys, Mr. Hawthorne," she said. "They just need someone to see past their hurt to who they really are." Then she was gone, her footsteps silent on the marble stairs, the front door closing with a soft click that seemed to echo forever in the sudden emptiness. Marcus stood alone in his bedroom, breathing hard, his hand still tingling from the slap. The twins slept on, undisturbed by the violence, wrapped in whatever peace Keisha had somehow given them. He looked at them, really looked, and felt something cold settle in his chest. When was the last time he'd seen them sleep like this? When was the last time their faces had been relaxed, free from the tension that seemed permanently etched into their features? He sank into the leather chair beside the bed, his expensive suit wrinkled from travel, his hands shaking as the adrenaline faded and left only a hollow, sick feeling in its wake. On the nightstand, Sarah's picture smiled at him, and beside it the note Keisha had left waited like an accusation he wasn't ready to face. Outside, dawn was breaking over Atlanta, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. But inside the Hawthorne mansion, darkness had never felt so complete. The silence that followed was unlike any Marcus had ever experienced. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a sleeping house or the tense stillness before a storm. It was the hollow, echoing silence of something precious being lost forever. Marcus sat in that leather chair for 3 hours, watching his sons sleep. As dawn crept through the floor-to-ceiling windows, he began to notice things he'd been too angry to see before. The way Jaden's breathing was deep and even, not the shallow, anxious panting that usually accompanied his rare moments of rest. How Jordan's face was completely relaxed, his perpetually furrowed brow smooth for the first time in months. When was the last time he'd seen them like this? When was the last time they'd slept in his bed at all? The answer came to him like a punch to the gut. Not since Sarah died. Not since the night of her funeral when they'd crawled under his covers, sobbing and asking when Mommy was coming home. He'd carried them back to their own beds that night, thinking structure and routine would help them heal. He'd been wrong about so many things. At 7:30, Jaden stirred first, his dark eyes blinking open in confusion. When he saw his father sitting there, his face immediately crumpled. "Where's Miss Keisha?" he whispered, the first words he'd spoken in weeks. Marcus felt something break inside his chest. She had to go home, buddy." "Is she coming back?" Jordan was awake now too, sitting up with his hair sticking up in every direction. Both boys looked around the room as if expecting Keisha to emerge from the shadows with her gentle smile and patient voice. Marcus couldn't answer. His throat felt like it was closing up. Instead, he reached for the note on the nightstand, unfolding it with trembling fingers. Keisha's handwriting was neat, precise, the penmanship of someone who'd been educated well before life had knocked her down. But it was the content that made his hands shake. "Mr. Hawthorne, Jaden responds best to routine but needs flexibility within structure. His tower building isn't destructive behavior, it's self-soothing. When he knocks them down, he's processing grief. Let him rebuild. Count with him. He likes patterns of 3. Jordan is highly sensitive to textures and sounds, but he's also incredibly empathetic. He reads facial expressions like most people read books. When you're stressed, he absorbs it and amplifies it. Try breathing exercises with him. 4 counts in, 4 counts out. They both miss their mother desperately, but they also desperately want to love you. They think they're broken because they can't make you happy. They're not broken, Mr. Hawthorne. They're just grieving. The lullaby they mentioned is Amazing Grace. Sarah used to sing it when they couldn't sleep. Jordan remembers every word. Jaden remembers the melody. Sometimes healing happens when we let ourselves remember instead of trying to forget. Take care of them. Take care of yourself. KW, PS. Jaden's elephant needs to be washed in cold water, no fabric softener. Jordan likes his orange juice slightly warm, not cold. They both sleep better with a nightlight that casts stars on the ceiling. Marcus read the note 3 times, each pass revealing new layers of understanding about his own children, insights he'd been too busy, too grief-stricken, too proud to see. A woman who cleaned his toilets for minimum wage understood his sons better than their father did. The boys were watching him with those wide, hopeful eyes that reminded him so much of Sarah, it physically hurt. "Daddy?" Jordan's voice was small, careful. "Are you mad at us?" "What? No, buddy, I'm not, Marcus stopped, really looking at their faces. They were scared. Of him. When had that happened? When had he become the source of their fear instead of their comfort? "Miss Keisha said sometimes grown-ups get angry when they're really just sad," Jaden offered quietly. "Are you sad, Daddy?" The question hit him like a freight train. He thought about the last 2 years, the endless parade of nannies, the business meetings that kept him away from home, the way he'd thrown himself into work to avoid dealing with his own grief. He'd been so busy being successful, being strong, being the provider that he'd forgotten how to be their father. "Yeah, buddy," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm really, really sad." Both boys climbed out of bed and came to him then, wrapping their small arms around his neck with a desperate hunger that made him realize how long it had been since he'd really held them. He buried his face in their hair and let himself cry for the first time since Sarah's funeral. "We miss Mommy too," Jordan whispered against his ear. "Miss Keisha said it's okay to miss people," Jaden added. "She misses someone too. Someone little like us." Marcus pulled back, looking at their faces. "She told you that?" "She didn't have to tell us," Jordan said with that uncanny wisdom that sometimes made Marcus forget he was only 6. We could see it in her eyes. The same sad we have. They spent the morning together, really together, for the first time in months. Marcus called in sick to work, something he hadn't done in 5 years. They made pancakes that turned out lopsided and too thick. They built block towers in patterns of 3 while Marcus counted along. They listened to Jordan recite Amazing Grace in his clear, sweet voice while Jaden hummed the melody. But by afternoon, the peace was cracking. Without Keisha's calming presence, old patterns reasserted themselves. Jaden had a meltdown when his elephant came out of the washing machine still damp. Jordan refused to eat lunch because the sandwich was cut wrong. By evening, both boys were asking for Miss Keisha again, and Marcus felt the familiar helplessness creeping back. That night, as he tucked them into their own beds for the first time in weeks, Jordan grabbed his hand. "Daddy, can you find Miss Keisha and say sorry?" Marcus looked down at his son's earnest face, then at Jaden, who was pretending to sleep, but listening intently. "Would you like that?" Both boys nodded. "Then I'll try," Marcus promised, though he had no idea where to even begin looking for a woman whose last name he barely knew, whose address wasn't in his files, who'd disappeared into the sprawling city of Atlanta like a ghost. But as he turned off the lights and listened to his sons toss restlessly in beds that suddenly felt too big and too empty, Marcus knew he had to try. Because for 3 magical months, Keisha Washington had given his family something he'd thought was lost forever. Hope. Finding Keisha Washington in a city of 500,000 people should have been impossible. Marcus had no address, no phone number, just a name and the vague knowledge that she lived somewhere in Auburn Avenue with her grandmother. But desperation had a way of making impossible things feel necessary. He started with the obvious places. The employment agency where he'd found her had closed down 6 months ago, leaving nothing but a vacant storefront with soap-scrawled windows. The community center on Auburn Avenue was more promising, a weathered brick building that had clearly seen better decades but still hummed with activity. The woman at the front desk looked up from her paperwork with barely concealed suspicion when Marcus walked in wearing his $1,000 suit and Rolex. He was clearly out of place in this world of peeling paint and second-hand furniture. "I'm looking for Keisha Washington," he said, trying to keep his voice humble. "She worked for me, and I need to speak with her." The woman's expression hardened. "You the man who put his hands on that sweet girl?" The words hit Marcus like ice water. Word traveled fast in tight communities, apparently. He felt heat creep up his neck, shame and guilt warring in his chest. "Yes," he said quietly. "I made a terrible mistake. I'm trying to make it right." "Mm-hmm." The woman looked him up and down like she was evaluating livestock. "And what makes you think she wants to see you after what you did?" Marcus had no answer for that. He'd been asking himself the same question for 3 days, lying awake while his sons cried for the woman he'd driven away with his anger and assumptions. "Maybe she doesn't," he admitted. But my boys, they need her, and I think she needs to know that what she did mattered." Something shifted in the woman's face. She studied him for a long moment, then reached for a scrap of paper. "Bethel Baptist Church," she said, scribbling an address. "She teaches Sunday school for special needs children. Service starts at 11. Marcus looked at the paper, then back at her. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," the woman replied. "You hurt that girl again, and you'll have more than just her grandmother to answer to. This whole community watches out for our own." Sunday morning found Marcus sitting in his BMW outside Bethel Baptist Church, watching families stream in for service. The building was modest compared to the megachurches in Buckhead, but it radiated a warmth that had nothing to do with architecture. Children ran between the adults, their laughter echoing off the brick walls. He almost lost his nerve 3 times. What was he doing here? What right did he have to disrupt Keisha's life again after what he'd done? But then he thought of Jaden's face when he'd asked for Miss Keisha, and Jordan's quiet question, "Can you find her and say sorry?" The children's Sunday school was held in a basement classroom painted cheerful yellow. Through the window, Marcus could see Keisha sitting on the floor surrounded by kids of various ages, some in wheelchairs, others stimming with toys or fidget devices. She was reading from a picture book, her voice animated and patient. He watched her for 10 minutes, seeing her in a completely different context. Here, she wasn't the maid who cleaned his house or the woman he'd struck in anger. She was a teacher, a caregiver, someone these children clearly adored and trusted. The realization of what he'd lost, what he'd thrown away, hit him like a physical blow. When the session ended, he waited by the church steps. Keisha emerged with an elderly woman who could only be her grandmother, the same intelligent eyes, the same dignified bearing despite her worn clothing and carefully mended handbag. "Miss Keisha!" he called out, his voice hoarser than he'd intended. She froze when she saw him, her hand instinctively going to her grandmother's arm. The older woman looked Marcus up and down with a gaze that could have melted steel. "So you're the man who thinks he can put his hands on my granddaughter," Ruby Jackson said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd survived Jim Crow and raised children through it. "You got some nerve showing up at the Lord's house." "Grandmama," Keisha said quietly, but Ruby wasn't finished. "Child, I've seen enough powerful men in my 78 years to know the type. They think their money gives them the right to treat folks like property, especially black women. My granddaughter ain't your property, Mr. Hawthorne." The use of his name surprised him. Word really did travel fast. "You're absolutely right," Marcus said, looking directly at Ruby. "I have no excuse for what I did. None. I let my anger and my prejudices control me, and I hurt someone who was trying to help my family." "Prejudices," Ruby repeated, the word sharp on her tongue. "At least you can say it out loud. That's more than most." Keisha had been silent through this exchange, watching Marcus with an unreadable expression. Finally, she spoke. "What do you want, Mr. Hawthorne?" "The boys," he said simply. "They're asking for you every day. They haven't slept through the night since you left. Jaden's having meltdowns again, and Jordan keeps drawing pictures of our family with you in them." Something flickered across Keisha's face. Pain, longing, carefully controlled hope. "And what about you?" she asked. "What do you want?" The question caught him off guard. He'd prepared speeches about the boys, about his regret, about making things right. Now, but what did he want? "I want to understand," he said slowly. "I want to know how you did what 47 other people couldn't do. I want to learn how to be the father my sons deserve instead of the father I've been." Ruby made a sound that might have been approval or skepticism. "Pretty words. But what happens the next time you get angry? What happens when your neighbors start talking about the black woman living in your house, taking care of your white children?" The questions hit home because Marcus had already heard the whispers. His business partner had made comments. His mother-in-law had expressed concerns. The social pressure was real, and Ruby knew it. "I don't know," Marcus admitted. "I can't promise I'll never make mistakes again, but I can promise that I'll never raise my hand to anyone again, ever. And I can promise that my son's happiness matters more to me than what anyone else thinks." Keisha looked at her grandmother, some silent communication passing between them. Finally, Ruby nodded slightly. "You want to understand?" Keisha said. "Then let me tell you something about those boys. Jaden isn't just building towers when he plays with blocks. He's creating order in a world that feels chaotic to him. When he knocks them down, he's not being destructive. He's processing his emotions the only way he knows how." Marcus nodded, remembering the note she'd left. "And Jordan," she continued, "that child feels everything. Every emotion in the room, every tension, every unspoken worry. When you're stressed about work or angry about something, he absorbs it like a sponge. That's why he has meltdowns. He's carrying emotional weight that isn't his to carry." "How do you know all this?" Marcus asked. Keisha was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the parking lot where families were loading into cars for Sunday dinner. "Because I used to be a teacher," she said finally. "Special education. I worked with children like your boys for 8 years before—" She trailed off, but Ruby picked up the thread. "Before she lost her own boy," the older woman said gently. "My great-grandson Jeremiah, 7 years old, sweet as pie, and smart as a whip despite his challenges." Marcus felt the air leave his lungs. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know." "How could you?" Keisha's voice was steady, but Marcus could see the pain she was holding back. "I don't talk about it. After he died, I couldn't be around children anymore. Couldn't trust myself not to get too attached, not to see him in every little face." "But you came back to it," Marcus observed. "The Sunday school, working with my boys." "Sometimes life doesn't give you a choice," Keisha said. "Sometimes you have to choose between your pain and someone else's need." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of shared loss hanging between them. Marcus thought about Sarah, about the way grief had made him retreat from his own children. At least he'd had the luxury of withdrawal. Keisha had kept serving, kept caring, even through her own devastation. "If you came back," Marcus said carefully, "what would you need? To feel safe, I mean, to trust that things would be different." Keisha exchanged another look with her grandmother before answering. "Boundaries," she said. "Clear expectations. I'm not a nanny or a maid or a substitute mother. If I come back, it's as a behavioral therapist working with your sons. Professional relationship, professional boundaries. And respect," Ruby added firmly. "My granddaughter has a master's degree in special education from Georgia State University. She worked at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta before her loss. You don't get to treat her like she's just the help." Marcus felt another piece of the puzzle fall into place. No wonder Keisha had known exactly how to handle the boys' behaviors. She wasn't some intuitive natural, she was a trained professional who'd been grieving too deeply to use her skills. "What else?" he asked. "Time," Keisha said. "Rebuilding trust takes time. And if you ever raise your hand to me again, I'm gone permanently. No second chances, no explanations." "Understood. And one more thing." Keisha's voice was quiet but firm. "Those boys have been through trauma. Their mother's death, your grief affecting the household, the parade of caregivers who left them. Healing isn't going to happen overnight. There will be setbacks, bad days, moments when you want to give up. If you're not prepared for that reality, then don't ask me to come back." Marcus thought about the past 3 days without her, the sleepless nights, the tears, the way his sons had looked at him with such desperate hope every time the doorbell rang. "I'm prepared," he said. Or at least I'm willing to learn how to be. Ruby stepped forward then, studying Marcus with those sharp eyes. You know what I think? She said. I think you're a man who's been carrying grief so long he forgot how to carry love. And I think my granddaughter might be the only person stubborn enough to teach you the difference. She turned to Keisha. What do you think, baby girl? You willing to try again? Keisha was quiet for so long that Marcus began to think she'd refuse. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Those boys deserve better than what they've been getting. If I can help them heal. She looked directly at Marcus. If I can help all of you heal, then maybe some good can come from all this pain. Marcus felt something ease in his chest that he hadn't realized was there. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, Keisha said, echoing the woman from the community center. We start fresh, Mr. Hawthorne. New rules, new boundaries, new understanding. And if it doesn't work, it'll work, Marcus said, surprised by his own certainty. It has to. As they walked toward their respective cars, Ruby caught Marcus's arm. Young man, she said, her voice carrying decades of hard-won wisdom. Let me tell you something my grandmother told me back when I was fighting for the right to vote. The measure of a person isn't in how they treat those who can help them. It's in how they treat those who can't. You remember that? Driving home through Atlanta's Sunday afternoon traffic, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in 2 years. Hope. Not the desperate, grasping hope of a drowning man, but the steady, sustainable hope of someone who'd found solid ground. He thought about what Ruby had said, about carrying grief instead of love. Maybe that's what the last 2 years had been. A master class in survival that had taught him everything about enduring loss and nothing about embracing what remained. But Keisha was coming back, not as his employee, not as his savior, but as a professional who understood his son's needs better than anyone else alive. And maybe, if he was very lucky and worked very hard, she might also become something else. Proof that families could be built from choice as much as blood, from commitment as much as biology. When he pulled into his driveway, he could see 2 small faces pressed against the living room window. Jaden and Jordan had been watching for him, as they did every time he left the house these days, afraid perhaps that he might not come back just like Keisha hadn't come back. But today was different. Today he had news that would chase away the shadows from their eyes, at least for a while. Today he could tell them that Miss Keisha was coming home. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Keisha returned to the Hawthorne mansion on a Tuesday morning in September, carrying a leather briefcase instead of cleaning supplies and wearing the kind of professional attire that commanded respect. The boy's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Jaden actually spoke her name clearly for the first time, while Jordan burst into tears of relief. But this wasn't the same arrangement as before. Keisha had insisted on a formal contract, clear boundaries, and a title that reflected her actual qualifications. Behavioral therapist and educational consultant. Marcus had agreed to everything, including her substantial fee increase and the requirement that he participate in weekly family therapy sessions. The first few weeks were a delicate dance of re-establishing trust. Keisha worked with military precision, documenting every interaction, every breakthrough, every setback. She created visual schedules for the boys, implemented sensory breaks, and taught Marcus techniques for managing meltdowns that didn't involve threats or bribes. Autism isn't something to be cured, she explained during one of their sessions, watching Marcus struggle with Jordan's refusal to wear certain textures of clothing. It's a different way of experiencing the world. Our job isn't to make them normal, it's to help them thrive as they are. The concept was revolutionary for Marcus, who'd spent 2 years trying to fix what he saw as broken. Under Keisha's guidance, he began to see his son's behaviors not as defiance, but as communication. Jaden's tower building became structured play therapy. Jordan's emotional sensitivity became a strength to be channeled, not suppressed, but success brought new challenges. Word of Keisha's presence spread through Marcus's social circle with the efficiency of digital wildfire. At the country club, conversation stopped when he entered. Business associates made subtle comments about unconventional childcare arrangements. His mother-in-law, Eleanor, became increasingly vocal about her concerns. The breaking point came during a dinner party Marcus hosted for potential investors. Keisha was working late, helping the boys with their bedtime routine when Eleanor arrived early and found her in the kitchen. "I don't understand why Marcus insists on keeping you around," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the particular venom reserved for people she considered beneath her station. "The boys need stability, not someone someone temporary." Marcus walked in just as Keisha was setting down the juice boxes she'd been preparing, her jaw tight with controlled anger. "Eleanor," he said coldly, "I think there's been a misunderstanding." "Has there?" his mother-in-law replied, not bothering to lower her voice. "Because from where I stand, it looks like you've developed an inappropriate attachment to the help. Sarah wouldn't approve of this situation." The mention of his dead wife hit Marcus like a physical blow, but it was the flash of pain across Keisha's face that ignited his fury. He'd seen that expression before, the carefully controlled hurt of someone used to being dismissed, diminished, treated as less than human. "You're right about one thing," Marcus said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Sarah wouldn't approve. She wouldn't approve of anyone speaking to a member of our family with such disrespect." Eleanor's eyes widened. "Family? Marcus, you can't possibly—" "Keisha has a master's degree from Georgia State University," Marcus continued, stepping protectively closer to Keisha. "She worked at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta for 8 years. She's doing more for my sons than any of the so-called qualified nannies you recommended ever did. And she's earned more respect in 3 months than you've shown her in 3 minutes." The room fell silent, except for the sound of Eleanor's sharp intake of breath. "If you can't treat her with basic human decency," Marcus said, "then you're not welcome in this house." Eleanor left in a flurry of wounded dignity and veiled threats about calling the authorities, about the children's welfare. The investors' dinner was canceled, and Marcus found himself facing the first serious consequences of his choice to stand by Keisha. But those consequences multiplied quickly. Eleanor made good on her threats, filing a formal complaint with Child Protective Services about inappropriate supervision and unstable household conditions. The investigation was brief but humiliating, requiring home visits, interviews with the boys, and detailed documentation of Keisha's qualifications and methods. Meanwhile, whispers about Marcus's situation reached his business partners. The IPO timeline was pushed back as investors expressed concerns about leadership stability. Marcus watched $847 million slip away because he'd chosen love over prejudice, family over money. The stress affected everyone. Jaden began having nightmares again, waking up screaming about bad men taking Miss Keisha away. Jordan regressed in his social skills, becoming clingy and anxious. Even Keisha, normally unflappable, showed signs of strain, dark circles under her eyes, a tightness around her mouth that spoke of sleepless nights. "Maybe I should go," she said one evening after a particularly difficult day. The CPS investigation had been closed, but the damage to Marcus's reputation was spreading. "I never wanted to cause problems for your business." "My business?" Marcus looked up from the legal documents scattered across his desk. Custody challenges, CPS reports, investor complaints. "Keisha, I built my business to provide for my family." If it can't coexist with what's best for my sons, then maybe it's not the business I thought it was. But the pressure continued to mount. Anonymous calls to the authorities questioned Keisha's background. Someone leaked details about her son's death to a gossip blog, painting her as emotionally unstable. The boys' private school began asking uncomfortable questions about their home environment. The final blow came from an unexpected source. Victoria Sterling, Marcus's ex-girlfriend from before his marriage to Sarah. She'd moved to New York years ago, building a career in fashion marketing and a reputation for ruthless ambition. Her return to Atlanta was supposedly for business, but her sudden interest in Marcus's personal life suggested other motives. "I heard about your challenges," she said over lunch at the kind of expensive restaurant where business deals were made and reputations destroyed. "It must be so difficult trying to raise those boys alone." Victoria was everything Keisha wasn't: polished, connected, acceptable to Marcus's social circle. She had the right education, the right background, the right skin color to blend seamlessly into his world. She also had something else: a complete inability to understand or connect with children who didn't fit conventional molds. "I could help," she continued, her manicured fingers touching his hand across the table. "Provide stability, respectability. The boys need a mother figure, not a— well, you know what I mean." Marcus pulled his hand away. "I know exactly what you mean, Victoria. And the answer is no." But Victoria wasn't someone who accepted no easily. She began appearing at social events where she knew Marcus would be present, always perfectly dressed, always surrounded by the right people, always positioning herself as the solution to his public relations problems. More damaging were her subtle campaign against Keisha. Victoria had connections in media, influence in social circles, and the kind of casual cruelty that could destroy reputations without leaving fingerprints. Stories began circulating about the unqualified woman caring for the Hawthorne children, about Marcus's inappropriate relationship with his employee, about the dangers of political correctness gone too far. The breaking point came during a school board meeting where Jordan's placement in mainstream classes was being discussed. Victoria appeared as a concerned family friend, armed with carefully researched talking points about the importance of proper credentials and stable home environments. "I'm not questioning Miss Washington's intentions," Victoria said, her voice carrying just the right note of reasonable concern. "I'm sure she cares deeply for the children. But caring isn't enough when we're talking about special needs education. These boys need professional intervention, not well-meaning amateur hour." Keisha sat in the audience, watching her qualifications being questioned by someone who'd never spent 5 minutes with an autistic child. Marcus felt something break inside him. Not his composure, but his patience with a world that valued appearance over substance, credentials over character. He stood up in the middle of the meeting. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the room. "I'd like to clarify something. Miss Washington isn't an amateur. She has a master's degree in special education and 8 years of experience at one of the country's leading children's hospitals. She's published research on autism intervention strategies. She's worked with hundreds of children like my sons." The room fell silent, all eyes turning to Keisha, who looked mortified by the sudden attention. "More importantly," Marcus continued, "she's helped my boys achieve more progress in 6 months than all the properly credentialed professionals managed in 2 years. So while I appreciate everyone's concern, I think I'll trust the expert who actually knows my children." Victoria's face went pale, then red, as whispers rippled through the audience. The school board, confronted with Keisha's actual credentials, quickly approved Jordan's mainstream placement with appropriate support services, but the victory came at a cost. Victoria's humiliation turned to genuine vindictiveness, and her connections in Atlanta's social elite were considerable. The whisper campaign intensified, focusing now on Marcus's defensive behavior and poor judgment in business matters. By November, the IPO had been officially postponed indefinitely. 3 major investors had pulled out, citing concerns about leadership stability. Marcus's business partners were making noises about a management change. Yeah, the empire he'd built over 15 years was crumbling because he'd chosen to stand by a woman who'd given his sons their lives back. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent so much time building wealth to provide for his family that he'd nearly lost his family in the process. Now, in trying to save his family, he was losing everything else. But something unexpected happened as his business empire cracked and crumbled. His actual family grew stronger. The external pressure had forced him and Keisha into a partnership that went beyond professional boundaries. They were allies now, united in their commitment to the boys' well-being despite the cost to their individual lives. The twins, sensing the adult stress around them, responded by growing more resilient rather than more fragile. Jaden began speaking in full sentences, his confidence boosted by months of patient encouragement. Jordan's emotional regulation improved dramatically as he learned to trust that the adults in his life wouldn't abandon him, no matter what external forces threatened. "We're like a fort," Jordan explained to his grandmother Ruby during one of her visits. "Daddy and Miss Keisha are the walls, and me and Jaden are safe inside." Ruby looked at Marcus, who was helping Jaden with a puzzle in the corner, and then at her granddaughter, who was reviewing educational plans with the intensity of a general preparing for war. "Sugar," she said to Keisha later, when they were alone, "I've watched you fight for those boys like they were your own blood. And I've watched that man learn to be a father instead of just a provider. You know what I think?" Keisha looked up from the therapy notes she was organizing. "What's that, Grandmama?" "I think sometimes God breaks things down so he can build them back up stronger. And I think what you're building here is going to last a lot longer than any business deal or social reputation." As winter approached, Marcus faced a choice that would define not just his future but the kind of man he wanted to be. He could salvage his business relationships by distancing himself from Keisha, restoring his social standing at the cost of his son's progress. Or he could double down on his commitment to the family they'd built, accepting whatever consequences came with that choice. The decision, when it came, was surprisingly easy. Looking at Jaden reading aloud for the first time, watching Jordan navigate social situations with newfound confidence, seeing Keisha smile with genuine happiness instead of professional politeness, Marcus realized he'd already made his choice months ago. He just hadn't admitted it to himself yet. The call came at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday in December, shattering the fragile peace that had settled over the Hawthorne household. Marcus fumbled for his phone, his heart already racing with the particular dread that comes with middle-of-the-night emergencies. "Mr. Hawthorne?" The voice was unfamiliar, professional, tired. "This is Dr. Patricia Chen from Grady Hospital. We have Keisha Washington here. You're listed as her emergency contact." The words hit him like ice water. Emergency contact. When had that happened? When had he become the person Keisha would call in crisis? What happened? Marcus was already reaching for his clothes, his mind spinning through possibilities. Car accident, heart attack, something with Ruby. She collapsed at her second job. Severe anemia, dangerously low blood pressure. "We're running tests, but—" The doctor paused, choosing her words carefully. "Mr. Hawthorne, when was the last time Miss Washington had a complete physical?" "I don't know. Is she going to be okay? We need to talk in person. Can you come in?" Marcus called his neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, to stay with the boys, leaving them sleeping peacefully while he drove through Atlanta's empty streets to Grady Hospital. The emergency room buzzed with its usual chaos of Saturday night casualties, but Dr. Chen led him to a quiet corner away from the noise. "Miss Washington is stable, but we've discovered some concerning abnormalities in her blood work," Dr. Chen said, pulling up results on her tablet. "Severely low red blood cell count, elevated white cells, enlarged lymph nodes. We need to do more extensive testing, but the preliminary indicators suggest a possible hematologic malignancy. Marcus felt the world tilt. You're saying she has cancer? I'm saying we need more tests, but yes, that's a strong possibility. Has she mentioned any symptoms? Fatigue, unexplained weight loss, frequent infections. Marcus thought back over the past months, pieces of a puzzle clicking into place with horrible clarity. Keisha's occasional dizzy spells that she'd blamed on low blood sugar, the way she'd sometimes lean against walls during long days with the boys, her increasing pallor that he'd attributed to stress from their public struggles. She works 3 jobs, he said weakly. I thought she was just tired. Mr. Hawthorne, if our suspicions are correct, Miss Washington has likely been symptomatic for months, possibly longer. The fact that she's been working at all, especially with children, shows remarkable determination, but also dangerous denial. Dr. Chen led him through sterile hallways to the oncology wing, where Keisha lay sleeping in a narrow bed, looking smaller and more fragile than he'd ever seen her. Ruby sat in the beside chair, her weathered hands clutching a worn Bible, her usual strength replaced by the vulnerability of age and fear. They think it's lymphoma, Ruby said without looking up, her voice barely above a whisper. Same thing that took my husband 30 years ago. Marcus sat heavily in the remaining chair, staring at Keisha's peaceful face. Even unconscious, she looked tired in a way that went deeper than physical exhaustion. How long has she been sick? He asked. Ruby was quiet for so long that Marcus thought she hadn't heard him. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of long-held secrets. She got the first diagnosis 3 months after Jeremiah died, stage 2 lymphoma. The doctors said with treatment, her chances were good, maybe 70–80% survival rate. Marcus felt his stomach drop. 3 months after. That was right before she came to work for me. Child needed the money for treatment, but more than that, she needed a reason to keep living. Losing Jeremiah nearly broke her spirit. When she found out she was sick too, Ruby shook her head. She was ready to give up. Said maybe it was God's way of reuniting her with her baby. The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. All this time, while he'd been worried about business deals and social standing, Keisha had been fighting for her life. While she'd been helping his sons heal from their trauma, she'd been carrying her own death sentence in silence. Why didn't she tell me? He whispered. Because she knew what you'd do, Ruby said, finally looking at him with eyes that held no accusation, only sad understanding. You'd have insisted on the best doctors, the most expensive treatments. You'd have made it about your guilt instead of her choice. My granddaughter needed to feel useful, needed to feel like her life still had purpose. Taking care of your boys gave her that. Marcus remembered the conversation they'd had months ago when Keisha had insisted on professional boundaries. He'd thought it was about respect and equality. Now he understood it was about so much more. It was about maintaining her dignity while she faced the unthinkable. Is she going to die? The question came out rawer than he'd intended. Ruby's hand found his across the narrow space between their chairs. Sugar, we're all going to die someday. The question is, what we do with the time we've got. Dr. Chen returned with test results that confirmed their worst fears. Keisha had stage 3 non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, aggressive but still potentially treatable. The prognosis was harder to predict than it might have been months earlier. The delay in treatment had allowed the cancer to progress, but her relative youth and previous good health worked in her favor. The recommended treatment protocol is intensive, Dr. Chen explained when Keisha was awake and alert enough to participate in the conversation. 6 months of chemotherapy, possible radiation, significant side effects. It's not going to be easy. Keisha listened to the medical details with the same calm focus she brought to everything else, taking notes and asking practical questions about timing and logistics. Only Marcus seemed to notice the slight tremor in her hands or the way she kept glancing toward the door as if calculating escape routes. "What about work?" she asked. "I have responsibilities." "Miss Washington," Dr. Chen said gently, "you won't be able to work during active treatment. Your immune system will be compromised and you'll need to avoid exposure to infections. Working with children would be particularly risky." The words hit Keisha harder than any of the medical terminology. Marcus watched her face crumble slightly before she rebuilt her composure, and he understood what the doctor's pronouncement really meant. Not just that she couldn't work, but that she couldn't fulfill the purpose that had been keeping her alive. "The boys," she whispered. "Jaden and Jordan, they need consistency. If I disappear again—" "You're not disappearing," Marcus said firmly, surprising himself with his certainty. "We'll figure this out. All of it. The treatment, the care, the boys. We're a family, remember? Families don't abandon each other." But even as he said the words, Marcus knew the challenges they faced were enormous. Keisha's treatment would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, money she didn't have, and insurance that wouldn't fully cover. The boys would struggle with another disruption to their routine, another loss of someone they loved, and he would have to find a way to balance his son's needs with supporting Keisha through what might be the fight of her life. The complications began immediately. Keisha's first round of chemotherapy was scheduled for the following week, but she had nowhere to recover afterward. Her trailer was too small and isolated for someone undergoing treatment. Ruby was too frail to provide the level of care Keisha would need. The obvious solution, moving her into the Hawthorne mansion, was complicated by everything from insurance regulations to the ongoing whispers about their relationship. But Marcus had learned something important over the past months. When you're fighting for your family, you don't worry about what other people think. "You're coming home with us," he told Keisha as they prepared to leave the hospital. "Not as an employee, not as a patient, but as family. The boys need to know you're safe, and you need to be somewhere you can focus on getting better." "Marcus, I can't." "Yes, you can," Ruby interrupted, speaking with the authority of someone who'd survived 8 decades of impossible choices. "Child, pride is a luxury you can't afford right now. Those boys love you, that man cares about you, and you've got a fight ahead that's going to take everything you have. Don't make it harder by trying to do it alone." As they drove through Atlanta's winter afternoon toward the mansion in Buckhead, Marcus realized that everything was about to change again. The careful balance they'd achieved, professional boundaries, social acceptance, financial stability, was about to be tested by something far more serious than gossip or business pressure. Keisha was fighting for her life, and that fight would define not just her future, but the future of the family they'd built from broken pieces and stubborn love. The truth came in fragments, each revelation more devastating than the last. It started with Victoria Sterling's unexpected visit on a gray February morning, 3 weeks into Keisha's chemotherapy treatments. She arrived with legal documents and a smile that could cut glass. "I'm so sorry to hear about Miss Washington's illness," Victoria said, settling into Marcus's living room with practiced ease. "It must be such a burden, having a sick woman living in your house with those vulnerable children." Marcus felt ice form in his veins. "What do you want, Victoria?" "To help, of course." She opened her briefcase with theatrical precision. "I've been doing some research into Miss Washington's background. Did you know she was terminated from Children's Healthcare of Atlanta? Not resigned, terminated." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Keisha had told him she'd left her job after Jeremiah's death, overwhelmed by grief. She'd never mentioned being fired. "That's impossible," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Victoria smiled, sliding a manila folder across the coffee table. "Hospital records are surprisingly accessible when you know the right people. It seems there was an incident involving medication errors. A child under her care suffered complications that could have been prevented. Marcus's hands shook as he opened the folder. The documents inside were damning. Incident reports, disciplinary actions, a final termination letter citing gross negligence resulting in patient harm. The child's name was redacted, but the dates aligned perfectly with Keisha's timeline. Of course, grief affects people differently, Victoria continued, her voice dripping false sympathy. Losing a child can make someone unstable, prone to poor judgment. The question is, do you really want someone with that kind of history caring for Jaden and Jordan? Marcus stared at the papers, his mind reeling. Every instinct screamed that this was wrong, that the woman who'd brought peace to his chaotic household couldn't be the same person described in these cold, clinical reports. But the documentation was thorough, official, impossible to dismiss. "What do you want?" he asked again. "Custody," Victoria said simply. "Temporary guardianship while Miss Washington recovers and you sort out this situation. I can provide stability, respectability. The boys deserve better than living with medical equipment and a terminally ill caregiver." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of small feet on the stairs. Jaden appeared in the doorway, clutching his stuffed elephant, his eyes wide with the particular anxiety that came with strangers in his safe space. "Where's Miss Keisha?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "She's resting, buddy," Marcus said gently. "Remember what we talked about? She needs lots of sleep to get better." Jaden nodded solemnly but didn't leave. He stood there, studying Victoria with the intense focus he usually reserved for his block towers, as if trying to solve a puzzle that didn't quite fit together. "Hello, sweetheart," Victoria said, her voice taking on a saccharine quality that made Marcus's skin crawl. "I'm Victoria. I'm here to help take care of you and your brother." Jaden's response was immediate and visceral. He backed toward the stairs, shaking his head frantically. "No!" he said, his voice rising toward panic. "No, no, no! I want Miss Keisha. Where's Miss Keisha?" The meltdown that followed was spectacular, even by Jaden's standards. He threw himself on the floor, screaming for Keisha, with a desperation that seemed to tear something vital from the air itself. Jordan appeared, drawn by his brother's distress, and within minutes both boys were inconsolable. Victoria watched the chaos with barely concealed disgust. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," she said, raising her voice over the screaming. "These children need structure, not emotional instability." But Marcus wasn't looking at Victoria. He was looking at his sons, seeing their raw terror at the prospect of losing another person they loved. Whatever was in those documents, whatever mistakes Keisha might have made in her past, she had become essential to his children's sense of safety in the world. "Get out," he said quietly. "Marcus, be reasonable. Get out!" The roar that came from his throat surprised even him. "Take your papers, take your threats, and get out of my house. Now." Victoria left, but not before dropping one final bombshell. "The custody hearing is next Thursday," she said from the doorway. "The judge will want to know why you're allowing a discredited healthcare worker access to special needs children. I hope you have good answers." The front door slammed, leaving Marcus alone with his screaming children and a folder full of accusations that threatened to destroy everything he'd thought he knew about the woman sleeping upstairs. He found Keisha in the guest room that had become her medical sanctuary, surrounded by IV poles and pill organizers, her head wrapped in a colorful scarf that couldn't quite hide the toll chemotherapy was taking. She was awake, but weak, her dark skin ashen with fatigue. "The boys are upset," she said immediately. "I heard them crying. What happened?" Marcus sat heavily in the bedside chair, the folder clutched in his hands like evidence at a trial. "Victoria came by. She had some information about your time at Children's Healthcare." Something shifted in Keisha's expression. Not surprise, but resignation, as if she'd been expecting this moment for months. "What did she tell you?" Keisha's voice was steady, but Marcus could see her hands trembling slightly. "That you were fired, that there was a medication error, a child was hurt." He opened the folder, spreading the documents across the hospital bed. "Is it true?" Keisha was quiet for a long time, studying the papers with the same careful attention she gave everything else. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "His name was Trevor. 7 years old, autistic, just like Jaden. He was having seizures, and I was responsible for administering his anti-seizure medication." She paused, closing her eyes. "I was sleep-deprived, working double shifts to pay for Jeremiah's medical bills. I miscalculated the dosage." Marcus felt his heart stop. "What happened?" "He went into cardiac arrest. We got him back, but he suffered brain damage. He's in a care facility now." "Permanent vegetative state." Tears were sliding down Keisha's cheeks now, but her voice remained steady. "I killed a child, Marcus. Not with malice, not intentionally, but I killed him as surely as if I'd used poison." The words hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Marcus stared at the woman he'd come to think of as his family's savior, trying to reconcile her with the image of a negligent caregiver whose mistake had destroyed a young life. "The hospital covered it up," Keisha continued. "Officially, Trevor's condition was attributed to complications from his underlying seizure disorder. My termination was kept quiet, no criminal charges filed. But I knew the truth. And when Jeremiah died 3 weeks later from complications during routine surgery, I knew it was God's judgment. I was being punished for what I'd done to Trevor." Marcus felt like he was drowning. Everything he'd believed, everything he'd built his new life on, was crumbling around him. The woman who'd saved his sons had killed another child. The professional credentials he'd defended so fiercely were worthless, tainted by a tragedy that made her care of Jaden and Jordan seem not just inappropriate but dangerous. "Why didn't you tell me?" he whispered. "Because I was selfish," Keisha said simply. "Because when I saw your boys struggling the same way Trevor struggled, I thought maybe I could save them. Maybe I could make up for what I'd done. Maybe God would forgive me if I could prove I wasn't just a killer in scrubs." "Jesus, Keisha." Marcus buried his face in his hands. "How could you not tell me? How could you let me trust you with my children after what you did?" "Because they needed me," she said, her voice breaking for the first time. "And because I loved them. I love them more than my own life, Marcus. I would die before I let anything happen to Jaden or Jordan." "You already let something happen." "To another child. To Trevor." Marcus was on his feet now, pacing the small room like a caged animal. "His parents trusted you the same way I trusted you. They thought you were going to help their son, and instead, I destroyed their lives," Keisha finished quietly. "Yes, I know. I live with that knowledge every single day. It's why I stopped practicing medicine. It's why I took a job cleaning houses. It's why I've been letting cancer eat me alive without fighting it the way I should." The admission stopped Marcus cold. "What do you mean?" Keisha looked up at him with eyes that held depths of pain he was only beginning to understand. "The chemotherapy I'm receiving? It's palliative, Marcus. Designed to slow progression, not cure it. The aggressive treatment protocol Dr. Chen recommended. I declined it." "Why?" "Because I don't deserve to live," she said simply. "Trevor's parents buried their child's mind, if not his body, because of my negligence. Jeremiah died while I was distracted by guilt and grief. I've taken enough from the world. I won't take more." Marcus stared at her. This woman who'd given his family everything while slowly killing herself with guilt and self-recrimination. He thought about the custody hearing, about Victoria's threats, about the choice he now faced between protecting his children and protecting the woman who'd already sacrificed everything for them. And in that moment, surrounded by medical equipment and legal documents and the weight of terrible truths, Marcus realized that the hardest decisions weren't between right and wrong. They were between different kinds of love. The custody hearing arrived like a storm that had been building on the horizon for months. Marcus sat in the mahogany-paneled courtroom, watching Victoria's legal team arrange their evidence with military precision. Across the aisle, his own lawyer shuffled through papers with less confidence, knowing they were fighting an uphill battle against documented medical negligence and a dying woman's presence in a household with vulnerable children. Judge Catherine Morrison entered with the gravity of someone accustomed to making decisions that would reshape lives. Her silver hair was pulled back severely, and her eyes held the particular weariness that came from years of witnessing humanity's failures played out in legal proceedings. "This is a petition for emergency custody modification," she began, reviewing the case file. "Miss Sterling seeks temporary guardianship of the minor children based on concerns about their current living situation." Victoria's attorney rose first, a sharp-dressed woman whose opening statement painted a picture of chaos and danger. She presented the hospital records with clinical precision, describing Keisha's termination, the medication error that had left a child permanently disabled, and her current terminal illness. "Your Honor, these children have already experienced the trauma of losing their mother," the attorney argued. "They're now living with a woman whose medical negligence destroyed another family and whose own deteriorating health makes her unfit to provide care. This is a tragedy waiting to happen." Marcus watched the judge's face as the evidence was presented. Every document seemed to build a stronger case against the life they'd built. When photos of Keisha's medical equipment were shown, IV stands, medicine organizers, hospital beds, the courtroom felt like a tomb. But then something unexpected happened. The courtroom doors opened, and Ruby Jackson walked in, followed by Dr. Patricia Chen from Grady Hospital. Behind them came a parade of faces Marcus didn't immediately recognize. Parents from Keisha's Sunday school class, former colleagues from Children's Healthcare, neighbors from Auburn Avenue. Ruby approached the witness stand with the dignity of someone who'd testified in courtrooms during the civil rights era, when the stakes were equally high but the audience far less sympathetic. "Your Honor," she said, her voice carrying decades of hard-won authority, "I've been watching this family for 8 months now, and I need to tell you something that those fancy papers can't capture." Victoria's attorney objected, but Judge Morrison raised a hand for silence. "My granddaughter made a terrible mistake 4 years ago," Ruby continued. "A mistake that cost a child his future and nearly cost her soul. But I've watched her carry that guilt every single day since, watched it eat away at her from the inside until she was ready to die, rather than risk hurting another child." She turned slightly to look directly at Marcus and the boys, who sat in the gallery behind him. "But those 2 little boys changed something in her. They needed what she had to give, and she needed to give it. Not because she was trying to make up for her mistake, you can't bring back what's lost, but because love doesn't stop flowing just because you've done wrong." Dr. Chen was called next, providing medical testimony that stunned the courtroom. Keisha wasn't receiving palliative care as she'd claimed. 3 weeks ago, she'd quietly switched to the aggressive treatment protocol, undergoing intensive chemotherapy that had already begun shrinking the tumors. "Why the change in treatment plan?" the judge asked. "She told me she'd found something worth living for," Dr. Chen replied. "She said 2 little boys needed to know that adults don't always leave, that sometimes people fight to stay." The final witness was Jaden himself. At 6 years old, he was barely old enough to understand the proceedings, but Judge Morrison had requested to hear from both children about their preferences. Marcus watched his son approach the witness stand with Marcus's heart hammering against his ribs. Jaden had been speaking more clearly in recent months, but formal situations still overwhelmed him. "Jaden," Judge Morrison said gently. "Can you tell me who takes care of you at home?" "Miss Keisha," Jaden replied without hesitation. "And how does that make you feel?" Jaden was quiet for a long moment, his face scrunched in concentration. When he spoke, his words were clear and devastating in their simplicity. "Safe," he said. "Miss Keisha makes the scared feelings go away. She sings Mommy's song when I have bad dreams. She stays when other people leave." Judge Morrison nodded slowly. "And if Miss Keisha couldn't stay anymore, how would that make you feel?" Jaden's eyes filled with tears, but his voice remained steady. "Like when Mommy went away. Like maybe I did something wrong again." In that moment, Marcus understood that the choice had never been between right and wrong, or even between safety and risk. The choice was between different kinds of love, the conditional love of society's approval versus the unconditional love of chosen family. Whatever Judge Morrison decided, Marcus knew his own verdict. Some things were worth fighting for, even when the fight seemed impossible to win. Message to American seniors, 200 words. Sometimes the most profound love stories aren't about romance. They're about the families we choose when life breaks us down and builds us back up. Marcus and Keisha's journey reminds us that real family isn't defined by bloodlines or social expectations, but by who stays when the world gets difficult. At 55, 60, or beyond, many of us know the weight of second chances, the pain of loss, and the courage it takes to love again despite our scars. Keisha carried the guilt of a medical mistake that destroyed one family, yet found redemption in healing another. Marcus learned that protecting his children meant choosing love over reputation, substance over appearance. Their story speaks to every grandparent who's helped raise someone else's children, every person who's been judged for unconventional choices, every family that's found strength in unexpected places. In our golden years, we understand that wisdom comes not from perfection, but from learning to see past surface differences to the heart underneath. True happiness isn't found in society's approval. It's discovered when we have the courage to build families based on love, loyalty, and the willingness to stay when others walk away. Interaction questions. Have you ever had to choose between doing what society expected and doing what your heart told you was right for your family? What's the most important lesson about family that you've learned as you've gotten older? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories matter and can inspire others facing similar crossroads. Judge Morrison's chambers felt smaller than the courtroom, more intimate, filled with law books that had witnessed decades of life-altering decisions. She'd asked to see Marcus, Victoria, and their attorneys privately before rendering her verdict, a practice that often preceded the most difficult rulings. "This is an unusual case," she began, settling behind her desk with the weight of Solomon preparing to divide a child. "I've been on the bench for 23 years, and I've rarely encountered a situation where both parties genuinely believe they're acting in the children's best interests." Victoria straightened in her chair, confidence radiating from every carefully chosen accessory. "Your Honor, surely the documented medical negligence speaks for itself. These children deserve better than living with someone whose mistakes have already destroyed one family." "And yet," Judge Morrison continued, opening Keisha's file, "I have testimony from multiple medical professionals stating that Miss Washington's error, while tragic, fell within the statistical range of human mistakes that occur in high-pressure medical environments. Dr. Chen specifically noted that the incident rate of medication errors among pediatric specialists is actually quite common, though rarely with such severe consequences." She turned to Marcus. "Mr. Hawthorne, you've heard all the evidence against Miss Washington. The medical negligence, the concealed termination, the terminal illness that initially included a rejection of aggressive treatment. Why do you still believe she should remain in your children's lives?" Marcus thought about everything they'd been through. The sleepless nights, the 47 failed nannies, the first time he'd seen his sons truly peaceful in Keisha's care. He thought about the way she'd held them through nightmares, taught them to manage their emotions, and shown them that adults could be trusted to stay. "Because she loves them," he said simply. "Not despite their challenges, but including them. And because she's fighting cancer, not just for her own life, but because my boys need to see that sometimes adults don't leave. Sometimes they fight to stay." Judge Morrison was quiet for a long moment, reviewing documents that would determine the fate of 2 little boys who'd already lost too much. "Miss Sterling," she said finally, "your concern for these children is noted and appreciated. However, the court finds that disrupting their current stable environment would cause more harm than the theoretical risks you've outlined." Victoria's face went pale. "Your Honor, surely you can't ignore—" "What I cannot ignore," Judge Morrison interrupted, "is the testimony of 2 children who have found stability and healing in their current environment. What I cannot ignore is the medical testimony that Miss Washington's current prognosis is actually quite hopeful with proper treatment. And what I cannot ignore is that love, messy, imperfect, complicated love, is often the most powerful healing force available to traumatized children." She signed the documents with deliberate strokes. "Custody remains with Mr. Hawthorne. Miss Washington is approved as a live-in caregiver with appropriate medical supervision." Case dismissed. Walking out of the courthouse into Atlanta's spring afternoon, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death: the absolute certainty that his family was exactly as it should be. Imperfect, unconventional, built from broken pieces and stubborn hope, but unshakably real. At home, Jaden and Jordan were waiting by the window, their faces pressed against the glass like flowers turning toward sunlight. When they saw him approaching, both boys ran outside, their questions tumbling over each other in excitement and anxiety. "Is Miss Keisha staying?" Jordan asked. "Are we staying together?" Jaden added. Marcus knelt down, pulling both boys into his arms, breathing in the scent of their shampoo and the lingering sweetness of childhood that he'd almost lost to grief and fear. "Yes," he said, the word carrying the weight of everything they'd fought for. "We're staying together. All of us." That evening, as Keisha tucked the boys into bed, her head wrapped in a cheerful scarf that couldn't hide her renewed determination to live, Marcus realized that sometimes the most important victories weren't won in boardrooms or bank accounts. They were won in the quiet moments when a family chose to fight for each other, when love proved stronger than prejudice, and when broken people discovered they could heal together in ways that none of them could manage alone. The impossible had become possible, one day at a time.